Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on forming an effective family business board and the question of advisory versus fiduciary boards. Before we get started, let's do a little orientation on your interface for today. So you have a panel at the side of your screen with an orange arrow. That orange arrow allows you to open and close the control panel. You can join by computer audio or by phone as you prefer. Your options are there. If you switch to telephone, you'll get the call-in information so that you can use your phone if you prefer. Our presenters are going to be speaking for about 45 minutes today, and we've allocated 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. You can enter your questions into the questions pod in your interface at any time, and at the end we will answer as many of those as we can. We're expecting a pretty good crowd today, so you might want to get those in early. We're also going to be recording this presentation, so all registered participants will receive a copy of this recording via email within the next 48 hours or so. You'll also get a PDF with the presentation documents as well as some additional reading and resources. So if you're worried or wondering about how to keep notes and keep track of what we're sharing today, all of that will be coming to you by email. You want to keep an eye on that. And if you really enjoyed this program and you wanted to share this with someone else, the recording will be available by accessing the webinars area of our website. You can register for that after the program and get access to that recording. With that, let's introduce today's presenters. Dr. Otis Baskin has worked with family-owned businesses around the world, frequently guides them through board development processes. In addition to his consulting work, Otis serves as executive editor for the Family Business Advisor, which is our monthly newsletter exploring family business issues. He's also emeritus professor of management at Pepperdine University, where he also served as dean. And he joins us from San Antonio, Texas. Welcome, Otis.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Mike Fassler is a principal consultant with FBCG with a career work he's worked with family businesses throughout, especially in agriculture, and with deep experience in the finance area. Mike's work with sibling and cousins teams often leads to conversations like the one we're going to have today about what good governance looks like in family firms. Mike hails from Western Michigan. Hi, Mike.
Hello, Christy. Hello, everybody, and greetings from Kalamazoo.
And I'm Christy Data, and I'm going to be your moderator for today. One more thing before we pass the presentation to Otis and Mike. We really value confidentiality. In our work, we frequently are placed in the care of sensitive information from families, and we take that responsibility really seriously. So to that point, any specific examples that we share today are either approved for use for educational purposes or they are composites of common experiences that we see with families. And last, this is designed as an educational dialogue. So in the business world, we hear a bit about best practices, but best practices are only best if they're best for your family. So we hope that you'll take today as a perspective that can inform your own decision making, and that you'll consult your own advisors, including consultants and potentially legal counsel for your own situation. So with that, I will pass the proceedings over to Mike to kick us off.
Thanks, Christy. Well, our focus today is about forming effective family business boards and whether an advisory or fiduciary board might be best for you. And we're going to talk about the similarities and differences between the two, things to consider as you make decisions about advisory board members or outside fiduciary directors, and practices for selecting and onboarding directors. And with the next slide, I want to talk a bit about kind of the progression of corporate governance. And as you think about the possibilities for your board, it's helpful to understand the range of common board structures. The progression in board structure from a paper board on the one hand to a fiduciary board on the other tends to follow the progression of a family business as it moves from being owner-centric to a business with more distributed leadership and ownership. Likewise, governance tends to move from informal to formal. And some of the factors which impact where on that progression is the best corporate governance fit at any particular time for any particular family enterprise includes the family's culture. Is it a open or closed culture? How much trust is operating within the business? Another factor, the size of the ownership group. the size and complexity of the business, the percentage of owners employed, number of non-family executives, and the number of generations in management. All of those factors have some influence on what's the right spot to be on that continuum. Just a note about family governance. Although we're talking about corporate governance today and how it might evolve, it's also important to evolve family governance in tandem as your family evolves to help ensure overall governance effectiveness. Now, with broader distribution of family business leadership and ownership, more formality is often introduced to manage what can be an increasing amount of relationship and decision-making complexity. With the founder of a family business, a paperboard may work just fine, but as the next generation starts to have an ownership interest due to share transfers or day-to-day involvement in management, a little more structure starts to pay off. And at minimum, starting to meet as a family-only board is a healthy practice, as it helps to develop boundaries between ownership, management, and family decisions. And it's these boundaries which help to protect family relationships and the viability of your family enterprise. You know, a next step from a family-only board is the addition of outside directors, be they advisory board members or fiduciary directors. And this is the topic for our discussion today. And at the point where family owners decide to add outside directors, a few important questions to answer include, should they be advisory board members or fiduciary directors? What level of independence should the outside directors have? How do we go about making a decision as to what's best for our family? And how do you go about the process of selecting and onboarding the outside directors? So, you know, a common question we get is, what's better, a family board, a board with independent advisory board members, or a board with independent fiduciary directors? And the answer is it depends. And it largely depends on what board composition will have credibility with the ownership group, what is best to assure accountability, and what will have the most powerful influence on trust. So we're looking for that, you know, credibility, accountability, and trust. Now, often a first step from a family-only board is to add advisory board members who are not independent. And these are usually some of the professionals already serving the family. And then as complexity goes up, some families transition to independent advisory board members or independent fiduciary directors, where the family maintains a majority of the board seats. You know, and sometimes it makes sense to have a fiduciary board with a majority of independent directors.
I think that's a good point, Mike, because we often see that happen in our practice over time as good businesses go through many generations.
And one of the in our experience, a challenging family or business situation most often triggers board progression, as compared to a family saying, hey, let's be proactive, get ahead of this, and evolve our board. And board evolution does come with challenges. You know, sometimes, for example, one of the challenges is that a family director or two need to step down to make room for those independent directors. And so being proactive because of some of those changes are best accomplished when there aren't any other major stressors that are present. So if your board can continuously have credibility with the ownership group as your family businesses evolves, you have one of the key ingredients to protect family relationships and achieve ownership group alignment. So Otis is going to now take us through a few thoughts on some triggers that tend to create action in terms of board progression.
You know, I think it's helpful to consider the formalization process as a natural consequence, really, of success. So If we look at the next slide, that helps us, I think, to consider some of those factors. Success in a business family certainly brings the need for increased formality in many ways, in many areas of your business, for sure, and certainly in many areas of your personal life when it comes to estate planning and things of that type. Formality is just the result of doing well in any good business situation. But in the case of good governance, it's important to remember that increased formality does not mean being bogged down in bureaucracy. I think that's very important to remember. But when can it really help you, and what can it help you to do? I think that formalizing governance can be helpful certainly when the person that's responsible for business operations is not the sole owner. Now, most businesses we work with began as sole proprietorships and over time have passed on to additional family member involvement, members that are both owners and sometimes managers. When that happens, sometimes we get a bit conflicted in terms of the roles that we play. So it's important to understand that if you aren't the sole owner, being more formal in governance processes can really be helpful. When other members of your family have ownership but no control over the business operations, it's important to recognize that those other owners do have capital at risk in your business, whether it's inherited or they actually purchase that capital stake. It is still being deployed through the operations of the business, and so they have a need for increased formality to assure their cooperation and their interest in where their capital is being used. When ownership is spread across a large group of shareholders as well, it's really important to have more formality. Just greater numbers brings the need to be more formal, more deliberate in the way we make decisions and do things. And it's also important to remember that formality can help to assure non-employed owners that those owners who are employed in the business are being compensated fairly. That is, that they are being paid according to industry standards, that the cost to replace them if something happened to that person is really being accounted for in the business. And it really helps everyone who has ownership to understand the true cost of operating their business. And so increased formality can be important on a number of fronts in terms of corporate governance. Let's look at some of the benefits that private businesses can derive from having more formal board processes. I think formal boards provide a lot of benefits that need to be understood upfront in order to see their value sometimes. First of all, I think that a more formal board provides a certain amount of credibility in business operations to everyone involved, not just owners, but also to key employees, to suppliers, to bankers, creditors of all types. And perhaps most importantly, it builds trust in family relationships because formal boards provide honest, objective opinions. People involved as either advisors or as fiduciary directors who do not have a dog in your race, so to speak. Their only reason for being there is to give you their best business advice, and that's exactly what you need from them. They provide a certain amount of self-discipline and accountability just because of the formality of their operations. They give you the best strategic thinking and counsel they possibly can. good insight into key issues that you wouldn't have otherwise because of a diversity of opinions. Challenging, provocative questions always come from these discussions, and those kinds of questions promote creative thinking that can provide new ways to approach business problems that can be extremely important. So there is a value here to stakeholder relations that goes well beyond just the improved business decision making actually. It really helps to maintain what we call patient capital in a family business. People are happy to continue to be owners. They're happy to be part of the process, even though they may not be employed directly, because they feel the business is doing the right things. Mike's going to help us understand some of the differences between advisory boards and fiduciary boards. I think that getting that focus right now will help us in the rest of our discussion. Mike?
Excellent. Thanks, Otis. So let's talk about just the basic differences between outside advisory board members and outside fiduciary directors. And put simply, advisory board members are appointed. They advise the fiduciary board, and they do not have a vote on board decisions. Fiduciary directors, on the other hand, are elected by owners and are entitled to a vote on board-related decisions. So outside advisory board members are appointed by the board, and outside fiduciary directors are elected by the shareholders. So that fundamental difference. And now I do want to say that even though one of the distinctions here is voting and non-voting, know that effective family business directors add the most value by influencing rather than voting. And using advisory board members will help fiduciary directors carry out their fiduciary responsibilities better. Also, just a couple points to remember to help ensure your outside directors have credibility with your ownership group. And again, whether they're advisory or fiduciary. First, an important question to answer is, to what degree does the ownership group want the outside directors to be independent? And raising the bar as to what constitutes independence, whether advisory board members or fiduciary directors, can be a powerful contributor to board credibility with the ownership group. So deciding on independence standards is a part of the process of adding outside directors. And secondly, to ensure the ownership group has an appropriate amount of voice in the recruiting and vetting process for outside board candidates. We're going to talk in more detail about that in a little bit. This will help them to be supportive of the outcome, whether you appoint advisory board members or elect fiduciary directors. Otis is going to turn now to some of the practicalities of fiduciary duties.
I think just defining this term fiduciary is really helpful. The next slide helps us to focus in on those specific duties that courts have recognized fiduciary directors and fiduciary executives have in carrying out their responsibilities. I think that the most important thing, though, to understand here is that a fiduciary duty really is the highest standard of care. And that's what we want for our businesses and our families. And so being a fiduciary really means being a responsible person operating in these situations, quite simply, all apart from legal definitions. But let's look at each of these of care that really are important. First of all, the duty of care itself is one that I think everyone really believes should be involved in any business decision making. It's simply being informed that directors, executives, all those folks making decisions have taken the necessary steps to be informed enough to make good decisions. And we all want that to happen. Yeah. There's also the duty of loyalty, and loyalty is extremely important in making good business decisions and also in maintaining good family relationships. Loyalty, really just put simply, is that the people making those decisions can be trusted to make the decisions in the best interest of the organization and its owners rather than in their own interest. That's being loyal to the company. It's being loyal to the owners who have put you in that position. The duty of confidentiality, the duty of good faith first. Duty of good faith is simply to say that the interests of the corporation are put first. You're really interested in doing what is best there, and that can be counted on. And confidentiality is not only assumed, it's a legal requirement. If you are a fiduciary, then things that are proprietary to the business, things that can be in any way detrimental to the business in terms of competition, etc., are held in confidence, and that's a requirement for a fiduciary. Prudence is also, and it really just means making good decisions. Any decision that can be considered to be reasonably within the bounds of good business. Disclosure is also a duty, and disclosure says that the fiduciary is bound to provide owners, those to whom you have a fiduciary duty, with all appropriate information about yourself and about the decisions that you are helping to make for that business. So it's really a matter of transparency with the owners to make sure that they understand how their businesses are in fact being governed. So fiduciary duty, it's important to remember, actually applies to all officers of a corporation, whether you are on the board or not. If you are an officer, you have a fiduciary duty to all the owners of that company. Let's take a look at some examples here in the next slide that help us, I think, to understand this just a little bit better. Fiduciary duty exists in two basic areas: the trustee-beneficiary relationship and the agent-principal relationship, and both of these are very important in family business ownership. Very often, ownership is held in trust for other family members who are the beneficiaries of that trust, and so the trustees are fiduciaries. Now, things can get very complicated if the fiduciary trustee is also an agent serving for the principals of the business. The agent is really a manager who is hired by the business to operate that business in the interest of the principals, the owners. But in family businesses, it's not unusual to find people in management positions who are also trustees for the shares of that benefit other family members. And so these things can get to be very complex as we understand how family businesses operate. The bottom line here, I think, is this: if managers or directors are trustees for shareholders, they must be very cautious on both fronts. And to remember that every agent is, in fact, a fiduciary for all of the owners of the business, not one branch of the family, not one owner over the other, but for all. I think that is something that is easy to lose in some of these discussions. Let's take a look at the next slide, which I think will help you to decide if you have a fiduciary duty. This is an important question to consider for your current situation, but also for your evolving situation within your family, ownership structure within your business responsibilities. Of course, you always want to ask your attorney for legal advice, and we don't offer legal advice at FBCG. But generally, in our experience, working with fiduciary boards and with senior management in these companies, we think these 6 elements can really help you to determine if you have a fiduciary responsibility. First of all, if you are not the sole proprietor of your business, then you have a fiduciary responsibility. And keep in mind, you may have started as the sole proprietor of your business, but then through good estate planning, tax planning, other mechanisms, you have passed ownership on to others, your children, your grandchildren, through various trust mechanisms, other ways. You are no longer then the sole proprietor, and you have fiduciary responsibilities that go with the transfer of that ownership. So when that happens, you need to begin to think of yourself differently. If you are only one of the heirs to shares of your business, then you have a fiduciary responsibility to the other heirs. I have one client that's a G2, second generation CEO of their business. The non-employed siblings in that business also had equal amounts of ownership. One day, as I was in my client's office discussing some things with him, the CEO, second generation leader of the business, turned to me with a bit of a complaint about the interference he perceived from his siblings. And his comment to me was, they didn't earn their ownership in this business. They don't have a right to a voice. And it was my responsibility as the consultant to remind him that they received their shares the same way he received his. And in fact, they did have a right to a voice. Now the question was the right level and place for that voice, which typically is in good governance processes. So if you have transferred, sold, or gifted shares to your heirs, then you have created a fiduciary responsibility for yourself and for others. If you have a minority partner or investor in your business, you also have created fiduciary responsibility. If you have an employee stock ownership plan, you have a fiduciary responsibility to those employees. And if you are the trustee for shares held in trust for someone else, you have a fiduciary responsibility there. It's important to keep those things in mind because they sneak up on us sometimes due to other decisions we make, either in estate planning or business planning. Yet they're very real, and they bring very important responsibilities with them. Mike's going to give us some understanding here of the similarities and differences between advisory boards and fiduciary boards.
So, understanding how boards with independent advisory board members function the same and how they function differently from boards with independent fiduciary directors, I think will be helpful for you to visualize how the alternatives might play out within your family's situation. So some of the similarities include that independent directors expect to be listened to. They want their viewpoint taken into account, and well-qualified directors, whether they're advisory or fiduciary, just simply won't tend to stick around if they don't feel like they're adding value. Another point is around decision-making speed, and as you start talking about the terms around formal and structure, that can start to scare some family business stakeholders off. But in reality, a similarity, advisory or fiduciary, is speed of decision making in the boardroom can actually go up, because many family business board decisions are made by consensus, and having that additional structure and experience in the room can help the board think and talk through decisions in a more deliberate way and actually reach consensus quicker. And it helps to avoid decision-making paralysis, helps boards, family businesses jump on opportunities quicker, and or perhaps respond to a crisis in a more timely manner. The third area is around management confidence and whether the management team consists of family and or non-family executives. Management confidence in board decisions tends to rise, and that has a positive impact on execution. And non-family executives really appreciate that additional objectivity in the boardroom.
Sure.
Level of professionalism, again, third-party objectivity helps with that and really positively influences the contribution of family directors, because it's kind of like, you know, having a guest in your house, if you will. You know, we all behave better when we have guests in our house. So, and then one other area is around contribution and engagement. The contribution that an independent board member makes and level of engagement they feel, whether they're advisory or fiduciary, we find it to be very similar. They tend to put the same amount of effort into being prepared for the meeting, contributing by asking great questions, listening, and providing meaningful input. So really not a lot of difference in terms of contribution and engagement. And then lastly, a similarity is committee service. So independent directors serve on committees such as audit, nominating, or compensation. And if it makes sense to their experience, oftentimes, whether advisory or fiduciary, they'll chair those. Independent directors will chair those committees. And so from a committee service standpoint, really no difference. You know, you do need to make sure if you have advisory board members that your bylaws and are structured in a way that permits other than fiduciary board members to serve on those committees. And a few of the differences, we've already talked about voting, and just want to reiterate the point that, you know, in family business boardroom environments, there's a lot of consensus building that tends to take place. And so oftentimes the impact of advisory board members not being able to vote, you know, really that can be insignificant, although it's a difference. Standards of independence, they tend to be less stringent for advisory board members, you know, and depending on the composition of the ownership group and family dynamics, the value of independent directors can sometimes be muted. So there tends to be an increasing level of independence as you move from advisory to fiduciary for your independent directors. And then some directors may feel a differing degree of commitment in an advisory capacity versus a fiduciary capacity. But, you know, just knowing that they have legal responsibility, you know, certainly in addition to the moral responsibility of the position, can make some feel a little bit more committed to the role. And then lastly, in terms of, around efficiency, since with advisory boards, since some in the room vote and some don't, that can get a little bit cumbersome, just managing the boardroom and managing the boardroom. And also if the fiduciary board makes a decision that's significantly different than what the advisor's thoughts were, and a lot of times there's logic to doing so, some explanation of the difference usually is warranted. And then lastly, there's simply a board operations cost difference because in terms of directors and officers liability insurance, fiduciary directors expect the D&O coverage along with any indemnification they may have through the bylaws or through a separate indemnification agreement. And since advisory board members don't have a fiduciary duty, just simply don't need the D&O insurance. So, Otis?
Great. Well, Mike, let's take a look at the next slide, which I think helps us to get back to that focus between informal and formal, and understand that while this is our observation and how corporate boards evolve, it is not a prescription. It's really a description of what we see. You're not obligated in any way to follow each of the steps we have outlined here at all. I think Mike's point is really important, that the differences between advisory board and fiduciary boards are primarily legal. Often an advisory board serves a role in helping the business and the ownership group adjust to board processes. And it can be very useful to have those outside advisors there that are taking part in this. It can be this interim step that helps to allay the concerns about a loss of control, for example. Fiduciary boards, though, of course, do bring a higher level of independence, which can also allay a lot of fears about loss of control for those owners who are not directly involved in day-to-day operations of the business. And so that is a next step that really brings complete formalization. But both of these examples work best with regular meetings set well in advance, where senior management shares proprietary information and seeks open discussion of all the options with everyone on the board, whether advisory or fiduciary. One of my clients who uses this model very well with an advisory board calls them open kimono meetings, meaning nothing is kept away from them. Everything is shared, nothing's hidden. That creates the best discussion and, of course, the best decisions. So advisory boards often and really should meet with those members who are actually legal board members. That discussion benefits everyone's ability to make the decisions, as Mike has pointed out. Now, the next slide, I think, helps us to understand something about control. One of the things that we often hear from some owners as we approach formalization of the governance process is a concern about losing control. And we want to make this point absolutely clear. That is, owners always have the power to decide in their business. But good governance is most effective when owners decide in advance where the authority for making various decisions will reside. And so we've provided this table, and there's a more detailed table available to you as part of this webinar today to help you make decisions. As we look at the first two decisions here that are really owners, you notice that owners make decisions about board composition, director selection. The board can influence that. But moving on, when it gets to leadership compensation, for example, it's the board that takes the lead there in making those decisions. And further down, as we look at things like business strategy, for example, management is really responsible for setting business strategy, but the board influences that. However, when it comes to hiring and firing key executive business leaders, management once again is important there in their decisions, but the board influences. And in business strategy, that's decided at the board but influenced by the owners in this situation. Well, these are just examples. It's up to you to decide how these decisions should be made, but it's important to decide and decide in advance so management, the board, and owners all clearly understand their role and can function well in that role. Mike is going to help us understand a little bit more about how to select and bring on board effective directors in a family business.
keeping in mind the theme that we're after effectiveness, the process of selecting and onboarding directors really impacts effectiveness. And as I think about effectiveness, two conditions that are really important are credibility of the board with the ownership group, and having those independent directors set up to deliver maximum contribution. And this is where recruiting and onboarding is so important. As you think about your nominating process and how you go about that, prior to going to market for candidates to fill positions and working through the selection decisions, be sure to have an agreed upon process to do so. And defining the objectives for your nominating process is the first step to having an effective process, because it helps to ensure that owners are on the same page regarding what they hope to achieve through this. Some nominating process objectives that are important include a process by which owners believe that the process will deliver objective and well-qualified directors, providing relevant stakeholders with a voice in establishing the director profile, what we're looking for in directors, and clear communication throughout the process so that everybody that believes the process has been administered fairly. And lastly, just being really clear about who has voice in the process and who decides, or as Otis talked about in the prior slide, who influences and who decides. And some other steps in the nominating process are to select a group or committee responsible for that nominating process. This is real work, takes a lot of time, and so we really have to form up a group to get that work done. Develop the candidate qualifications in terms of specifying what you're looking for. Going out, identifying potential candidates, and screen and select them, and then either appoint the advisory board members, being the final step, or elect the fiduciary directors. So those 5 additional steps. And then, as you think about recruiting and the selection process, before considering specific candidates, make sure you have alignment within your board and ownership group as to the qualifications desired in candidates. If you start having discussions about specific people in advance of defining those qualifications, those discussions get really divisive amongst owners, or can get really divisive among owners and family. And then if a pre-named director is selected, that can reduce the level of the credibility of the independent director, regardless of how well suited they are for the position. And then using the qualifications as your guide, start that recruiting process, and then screen based on qualifications and fit to your family business's culture. You're gonna surface good, solid candidates, and remember, you're looking for the best fit candidates. Then lastly, let's talk just briefly onboarding process. Whether you're moving from a family board to a board with outside directors for the first time, or the outside directors' terms have ended and they're turning over, just recognize that a new group is forming up. And it's going to take some extra effort to get that new group up and running and working together effectively, and that's where the onboarding process comes in. Certainly providing background information, bylaws, shareholder agreements, financial statements, perhaps the latest company valuation, all of that type of, along with for example, a family tree diagram. All of that information helps those new board members start to come up on plane in terms of understanding what's going on in the business. And then working in some time with board members for a meet and greet in advance of the first board meeting, perhaps a strategic plan briefing by management, having some time for interaction with family members over lunch and dinner are just some examples that will help you familiarize and start to onboard those independent directors. Because you know, a good start pays off in terms of the effectiveness of those independent directors. Okay. Then we're going to finish up with just one more thought. There's our familiar corporate governance progression. So, you know, and as you think about, you know, where you should be with your corporate governance structure, consider where you are on the continuum between being an owner-centric family business or one with more distributed leadership and ownership, and then use that to help guide you as to what board structure is going to create the best conditions, you know, for that credibility, accountability, and trust that you're looking for. And I guess one last thought for me on this is, you know, start earlier than you think you need to, because it'll pay off. It'll pay off. Otis, any last thoughts from you?
I agree, Mike. It will pay off. It's a process, not a prescription. So keep in mind that you're progressing along here, and not everyone progresses at the same pace. Not everyone has the same needs. These are all things that have to be considered with each individual circumstance.
Perfect. Thank you, gentlemen, for what's been a very informational discussion so far. We're getting a lot of great questions into the question pod, and I encourage people to keep submitting them. I'm going to do a quick aside while we prepare to take those questions. For those of you who are interested in this topic, certainly you'll get the materials by email. You know, and if you're new to FBCG, you know, our team works with family businesses and families of wealth around the world on governance and other related matters. You can find out more about us on the website. We also have books that you see there on the screen on governance, family councils, and building effective boards that are available through our website, or also available on Amazon and other booksellers. And the Family Business Advisor, of which Otis is our executive editor, is our monthly newsletter, which also shares ideas on this topic that you can receive by email. So,
and this month's article is a great one by Mike on that very subject.
Good point. Good point. Thank you so much for sharing that. So let's go ahead and go to some questions. So this is an interesting question. Do you have an opinion on which type of board you think is more prone to foster or cultivate innovation?
Well, you know, let me start there, and Mike, please chime in.
Sure.
I think either can be very productive in fostering innovation. It's really about how it's operated. So if the right people are added to either advisory board or a fiduciary board, those people can bring innovative ideas and creative thinking. That's really the secret sauce. It's getting the right discussion going in that session, that meeting.
I would, you know, add to that that culture of innovation certainly goes beyond the boardroom. So if it, you know, if it's alive and well within the organization, that's probably going to extend to the boardroom, and also will, you know, impact the qualifications you're looking for in terms of folks who have demonstrated the ability to think and make decisions in that way.
True, very true.
Great. Our next question is around what kinds of approvals or votes are brought to a fiduciary board? So how do we not bog them down with day-to-day decisions? How do we determine what is a board decision?
Well, you know, one of the things that I've seen is that the new fiduciary directors really help you to do that. Advisory board members can as well. But the point is that having people with business expertise that you respect added to your board discussions really raise the level of that discussion to a more strategic level. One of the reasons they do that is they aren't present day to day in your business operations, and so they really can't help you make those day-to-day down in the weeds decisions, but they can help you with strategy.
And a few thoughts to add to what Otis said is that I'd start with the decision grid Otis covered and say, okay, what is the province of board decisions, and then help use that to help drive your agenda, and that will help you get a cadence to your agenda throughout the year, and that's going to help stay out of those tactical operational details.
One other tool that's helpful there, Christy, is it's important to set board meetings well in advance. I always recommend that clients set them a year in advance, and that each board meeting have an advanced topic specified. Now, it doesn't mean other topics can't be discussed, but a board meeting should be set aside to discuss business strategy. Another one should be set aside to discuss financials, etc.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions in the queue here that seem to relate to how to think about board development or developing an advisory or fiduciary board when you have a family that's in conflict. So in your experiences in those situations, what questions do you ask, or what do you advise families to think about on how to sequence work or work through that?
Well, I think that it all depends on the nature of the conflict, of course, and as one of our colleagues would say, of course, it all depends. But I recently had a client in that situation. There was a lot of conflict between the third and second generations over the business. The third generation that had come into adulthood and ownership was not comfortable with the way the second generation had made decisions pretty much in a closed environment. So much so that some of the third generation members were advocating sale of the business, or at least selling large portions of it to buy people out to just get out of it. They were able to bring harmony both in the family and in the business by putting together a working group that set some very clear governance decision-making policies, how those decisions would be made and how they would be communicated. And then they put together a committee, as Mike pointed out earlier, that searched for independent directors and brought those independent directors to the board, creating an environment where everyone had more trust in what was done and how decisions were made. And that made a huge difference both at the business level and the family level.
It's, as I work with clients to develop their board and add independent directors and have conversations with prospective candidates, the well-qualified board members are usually somewhere asking the question, so how well functioning is the family, and when there are challenges, what venue do those challenges get handled in? Is it the boardroom, or what do they have in place in terms of family governance? So I think part of the answer is being clear that we have those boundaries between family ownership, and the board represents the ownership group and management. And if those boundaries are completely permeable, it'll just be chaos. And if they're too rigid, then the family really isn't influencing the enterprise. So it's some kind of balance, but it's all about having the right discussions in the right venue.
That's a very good point, Mike, because it's really counterintuitive, but nevertheless true, that increasing formality actually preserves family relationships as well as business relationships.
Great. Another question here is around sort of transparency in the process. So should qualifications for selecting effective directors be public knowledge to candidates or, I suppose, other stakeholders, or should they be kept to the management and owners?
Well, in the searches that we do at FBCG, we publish the qualifications in the board prospectus that is used to search for new directors. You know, I think when you're asking someone to consider taking either an advisory or a fiduciary role, it's important for you to tell them what you expect them to add. They need to make that decision in terms of whether or not they feel they have those qualities to provide.
And the you know, I'd say any qualified directors, they're gonna be asking, what am I expected to do, and how does the board structure work and the operations work? So, you know, getting it out there to those candidates is critically important to the recruiting process. And also, it'll help some candidates self-select out because they'll see they won't fit, and it'll make your search process significantly more efficient.
That's very true. The other thing is it also helps in evaluating, is the board actually doing what you want it to do? If you have been careful in disclosing what you want board members to contribute, then you can do an annual evaluation, really asking the board, are we accomplishing this?
Great. We'll take one more question before the end of the program, and before we do, I put up on the slide, everyone, contact information for your presenters for today, and web information as well for the firm. For those of you whose questions we didn't get to, we'll do our best to follow up with those in the coming days. But we also have a question here, which is a circumstance that I think we see fairly frequently. It says, our board is made up of 3 sibling owners as well as 1 advisor or proxy per owner. As ownership is passed to the next generation, do you recommend that each owner of the new generation add their own advisor or proxy?
Absolutely not.
Just
stay away from it. What you're doing is you're adding champions fight for your cause. Instead, you should add people who are there to help your business and all owners.
Mm-hmm. It goes back to those fiduciary responsibilities, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes back to trust. You want to be able to trust that everyone entering that discussion has the best interest of all owners at heart.
Yeah. And to go that way, longer term, it's going to be increasingly divisive and, you know, tend to build up silos.
Exactly. So if you select new directors or new advisors to your board that everyone agrees are qualified and everyone respects, then you're right there creating an environment for agreement and progress.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Otis, for your participation in today's discussion and all of your thoughtful contributions. And thank you to those of you who are joining us remotely today for being a part of the program. We hope that we'll see you at a future event of ours. Please stick around and complete a survey after the program. We're really grateful for your feedback. It helps us plan for future events. And I hope everyone has a good rest of their week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.